All right, we'll go ahead and call the meeting to order. This is the May 10th, 2016 Special Council Committee meeting. And the first item on the agenda is under administration. Mr. Howard, do you want to lead this?
Well, there ain't much to lead, but just to introduce J.D. Cheney here to update us on the legislative update for 2016 and give us some ideas what happened.
The floor is yours. Yeah, thank you for being here. Hopefully we'll have more people filter in as time goes here.
I'll stand here. I feel a little formal. Anyway, y'all hear me without talking on the microphone?
Yes.
You know, we started the legislative session. I couldn't have told you, and Sherry's already heard this, the Clerks Association. Those of you that talked going into the session know that I didn't think that they would accomplish a whole lot. Brand new governor, didn't quite know what to expect out of him.
Ralph can't hear you in the back.
Who?
Ralph, he's behind the screen. He tapes it. He can't hear
Oh, okay.
Oh, so I have to talk into the microphone, huh? That's okay.
Sorry.
So that's going to be an echo there. So we had a brand new governor. Didn't quite know what to expect out of a new gubernatorial administration. It had been 8 years since the last transition. We had, for the first time, a competitive situation in the House of Representatives where it looked like the Republicans were going to be able to take the House of Representatives or tie it, which created a lot of partisan politics in the House. And most people thought, well, maybe one or two bills. We'll be lucky if we get a budget enacted. And if you all have kept up since they adjourned sine die April 15th, they, of course, got a budget adopted. And, in fact, they did a lot more than what we would have ever predicted in terms of city-related legislation. Just to give you an idea of what the session looked like, there were 941 bills that were introduced. So legislators introduced 941 separate bills. 159 of those passed. That is a 14.8% passage rate. So if you were going to go take a test and you knew that only 14.8% of the people that took the tests were going to pass, you probably wouldn't feel real confident about your chances of passage. It's the same thing with a bill. Sometimes it looks a lot easier than it is, but it is extremely complicated to get a bill introduced in one chamber, through a committee, through the other chamber, over to the other chamber, through that chamber's committee, all the changes reconciled, and finally put on the governor's desk. So only about 14.8% of the bills passed. The average seems to be anywhere from 11 to 12% is generally what passes. So even this figure tells you they passed more legislation than they typically do during this last session. We tracked 272 bills. The league tracked, which identified those 941 that related to city governments directly. 272 of them impacted cities one way or another. We supported, the board of directors voted of those 272 to directly support 103 of those bills, and 38%. So league-supported bills had a 38% passage rate. Even if they weren't a KLC initiative, the board looks to say whether we're going to support or oppose or be neutral. 38% of those passed compared to the 14.8 general passage rate. And our board voted to oppose 30 of those 272 bills. The other ones we were neutral on or had no position. Of the 30 bills we opposed, 0% passed. So it's a lot easier. Lesson here is it's a lot easier to kill bills than it is to pass bills in the General Assembly. But we're pretty proud of the record that when the league ends up taking a position to oppose legislation, that it generally doesn't make it through the legislative process. Let's start with House Bill 237, just to describe the bills that passed, and I'll try to go through this more quickly than I typically do. We've only had one bill signing so far. I need to go back and tell you, 16 KLC initiatives that we actually wrote passed this session. So it's probably the best session we've had in a really long time. So we're going to have a lot of bill signings, ceremonial bill signings with the governor post-Derby. But we did get this one, House Bill 237, which creates an optional property tax exemption for data centers. So the sponsor who introduced it originally a couple of years ago had put in a provision that mandated that all data center types of Google or things like that for data storage would be exempt from local property taxation. He got creative, rewrote it, and made it a permissive exemption by attempting to define a data center as a manufacturing establishment. Now, I don't know, Frank, whether it will pass constitutional scrutiny or not, but it was a great compromise to not have to oppose a legislation to give cities an additional option if you have the potential for inducing a location of a data center. Senate Bill 46, you see your senator up there who carried that bill for us, Senator McDaniel. Senator McDaniel carried Senate Bill 46, which made several revisions to local legacy pension plans. Now, has Senator McDaniel already been here to give your council the update? So he probably told you. I guess this is the one bill that maybe passed this session with his name on it. And he carried the bill for us. You all probably have some legacy pension plans. When you look at those statutes for your police and fire, when you look at those statutes, it doesn't deal with how to dissolve it or shut it down once all the beneficiaries or active members retire. The statutes didn't deal with if you had a joint police and fire, but you had no fire participants or fire beneficiaries, what to do with the governing board. And so Senate Bill 46 provides options because we're seeing these cities start to die out on these legacy pension plans, no beneficiaries left. And so it requires a restructuring of the pension board when there are 6 or fewer active or retired participants. It gives you the option to be able to cover some of those that would otherwise be vacant positions. Allows actuarial studies once every 5 years if you have 6 or fewer. So instead of doing annual actuarial analysis, if you're down to 5 or fewer beneficiaries left under those legacy pension systems, you don't have to spend all of the proceeds doing actuarial studies at that point. You're on your last leg. It's fairly easy to predict what the additional costs are going to be during the term, and establishes a liquidation process which didn't exist in any of those legacy pension plans prior to. Once all the benefits are paid out, what happens to any funds left in those legacy pension plans? And this allows you to liquidate in a process to get that added to the general fund of the city. HCR 13 passed. We played a big role on that. That's Representative Brad Montel from Shelbyville, Republican House member, actually got this provision through. We had a city in Bullitt County, Hillview, if you read this in the newspaper, that actually declared bankruptcy. The first American city since Detroit to declare bankruptcy. And they had a judgment against them for $13 million for breach of contract. Now, you can't buy insurance to protect you from a breach of contract. It's not available on the market. So the plaintiff's attorney in the case, won at the circuit court level, immediately proceeded to garnish all the accounts of the city, which meant you couldn't pay the tax collectors, you couldn't pay the clerks, you couldn't pay the police, you couldn't pay anybody in the city when they garnish the account. Most states have a prohibition against judgment creditors being able to garnish public accounts. It doesn't exist in Kentucky. You may have seen this issue surface in the race for Kentucky Attorney General this last election, because the plaintiff's attorney was Andy Beshear, who's now our Attorney General, who was involved with this municipal bankruptcy situation and did the garnishment of the account. The city was forced into a bankruptcy situation. It didn't have the funds to be able to pay the $13 million. They had to file bankruptcy once it went through the appellate process. What we found in Kentucky was an amazing lack of clarity with regard to the rules and the structure for being able to enter into bankruptcy court. There was an argument that cities that had taxing ability left, the failure to exercise that taxing ability disqualified them from going into the bankruptcy court. The bankruptcy court never got to answer that question because the city ended up settling with the trucking company for the breach of contract with the plaintiff's attorney. But what HCR 13 will do is actually create a task force of the Legislative Research Commission with legislators to study the Kentucky laws, look at other state laws to put a new structure with regard to access for the bankruptcy courts for Kentucky cities. The one thing we'll want to get out of that from a city perspective for sure is a prohibition like other states have on plaintiffs' attorneys, trial attorneys being able to garnish public accounts and essentially shut down cities. That's a bad provision of public policy that we don't have that provision. House Bill 497 passed. You notice this wasn't a KLC-supported bill. Their board voted to go neutral, surprisingly, on this bill. It's a preemption piece of legislation. Typically, I predict if a law starts out, no city shall do this or that, or a prohibition, I predict that the board's going to vote no to oppose the bill. This one they voted to go neutral on. I've only seen that a couple of times. Once last session, the board voted not to oppose a bill that prohibited cities from regulating the donation of wild game meat to feed the homeless. Then this session, and then one other session, we voted to go neutral on a preemption of local governments being able to regulate breastfeeding in public. The board just said stay out of that, don't get in that debate. Now they said stay out of this seed law debate. Evidently some local communities are looking at GMOs, labeling, packaging, propagation of seeds. It's just not an issue in Kentucky. It's not, we're a pretty agriculturally based state. Our communities are fairly rural. There wasn't any desire of the board to say, we want to get in the seed regulation business. So they had us go neutral. And as a result, the bill passed. So from here on out, if you had a strong desire, Bill, to regulate seed package labels, you're not going to be able to do that anymore on the Erlanger.
Darn it.
That all worked out.
No more tilling for
House,
anybody.
House Bill 153 deals with the situation with volunteer firefighters that go into that retire from one of the KRS administered state retirement system. If they go into a position, a retiree goes into a position where they're on a volunteer basis, they just receive reimbursement for actual expenses or just nominal fees of less than $500 per month. They're exempt from the requirements for having a break-in service or the prohibition on having a prearranged agreement. If the employee isn't doing that with a previous employer, the employer they're retiring from, and the employee does not become a full-time employee for at least 24 months following taking on that volunteer work. So the situation, rather narrow but more common with 416 cities and a myriad of special taxing districts, and you may imagine, we have a lot of retirees who want to continue to be volunteers or start being volunteer firefighters or things like that. And it was a prohibition if the volunteer department, if the department was a participant in CERS for them accepting those roles during that term. So it's a very narrow exception. Mainly is going to hit your volunteer firefighters. Senate Bill 168, you'll see the testimony there with the new state auditor, Auditor Mike Harmon, and Senator Steve West, the new senator from Bourbon County, actually in central and eastern Kentucky. First Republican to hold that seat probably ever. He sponsored legislation that clarified, that was supported and written by KLC, that clarified the ability of the state auditor to come in and do special exam audits of city governments. Now, the reason we had to do legislation on this was because we had a city of Somerset. I just named the city. I couldn't do that at the clerk seminar, could I, Sherry? But the City of Somerset actually opposed and filed a lawsuit against the auditor who started the special exam in the City of Somerset. The league had always held that the general statutes applicable to the auditor permitted them to come in and do a special exam. Now, we're not talking about regular financial audits that you contract with your CPAs to do. This is like the League of Cities went through in 2010, like the airport board and all the things that hit the press, like your airport board up here, I think, went through it, like the University of Louisville's going through and their board of trustees. A special exam where there's been some allegation of waste, fraud, or abuse. The auditor's office has always had that authority, but we needed to clarify that in statute. And it would have been impossible for this organization to go to the table and oppose legislation that essentially told the auditor or legislature, yes, auditor, you have the authority to audit counties, you have the authority to do special exams on the retirement systems, universities, every state government, even our agencies, their PSAPs and tourism commissions and other agencies that we create. But the one public institution you don't have the authority to audit in Kentucky, city governments. You can't do special exams. That would not have flied very well. But in putting it in the legislation, we got something that no other institution got, which is the guarantee that we get detailed billing from the auditor's office about when instead of just getting an invoice to say, hey, we did a special exam, it's $100,000, pay it, which is what happened at the league after they did the special exam, without any detail of actually supporting the cost. They're required, if they do a special exam of a city, and they will not come in unless there's a legitimate allegation of weight. They just don't have the resources. So we don't need to worry about the auditor's office running the muck, doing special exams just for the heck of it. But they have to give you a detailed invoice of the total costs, the total staff hours, the total travel cost, and other expenses, and be able to break it down. They kind of resisted that at first, but I pointed out that it would be kind of ironic for them to oppose that, because if they were in here auditing a city and we paid an invoice without any supporting documentation, they would write you up in the audit for that. So they might as well comply with what they would write you up for doing. So that's Senate Bill 168. Senate Bill 167, Senator Mike Wilson from Bowling Green actually sponsored a piece of legislation on an act related to city governments. So just like you all, when you all do your ordinances, your ordinance has to relate to one subject. The General Assembly has the same restriction. Legislation can only relate to one subject, which as you watch the legislative process as it goes through, sometimes there's some pretty creative titles attached to legislation. Now, I titled this one an act related to city governments because it deals with about 6 or 7 different areas of city government, but I wanted to get them all relatively small issues, all put into one bill, rather than trying to track down 6 or 7 different bills. So Senate Bill 167, the first thing it does is amend the statute that I hate the most, which is the Disposition of Surplus Property Statute 82.083. I would rather just repeal the statute, but that's impossible now because that would be anti-transparent and disposing of property, and it would never pass the legislature. So we tried to expand the process by which a city could dispose of its surplus property and clarify some of the rules related to it. First of all, it allows you to transfer with or without compensation real property for the purposes of eliminating blight. So you don't have to go through a sealed bidding process in order to transfer real property for the purposes of eliminating blight. That kind of coincides, if a city exercises Chapter 99 condemnation powers, it kind of coincides with that. A lot of cities, when they purchase new police cruisers, I heard somebody talking about really wanting to do that today. If they have old cruisers to have to trade in, a lot of cities will trade in, use the trade-in value in order to purchase the next one. Well, most city attorneys will tell you, well, you know, if you're disposing of the old cruiser, you got to do it in accordance with the statute. You can't just drive it and trade it in. This will allow you to do a trade-in to purchase the same or a similar type of product if you obtain for that trade-in value at least its fair market value as determined by an independent appraisal. Now, an independent appraisal is defined in this new law as being an appraisal, having an appraiser look at the property that's not a city employee or city official or related to a city employee or a city official, or by using nationally published standards like Kelley Blue Book value or something along those lines to determine the fair market value. So you can do trade-in as long as the trade-in value given is at least its fair market value. If we're talking about small items, less than $5,000, if you have an appraisal and something's valued less than $5,000, you can transfer it any way you want to, straight out sale, as long as you obtain at least fair market value. Why? Because sometimes selling some of this stuff is ending up costing more than what the property's actually worth. So when you have small value items, going through a rigorous bidding process is unnecessary. We clarify that if something's scrap or garbage, it can be treated as garbage, thrown away. The statute did not provide that ability not to declare it surplus and go through a process, so it clarifies that. Or it could be sold by the Finance and Administration Cabinet under an agreement. The state Finance and Administration Cabinet has a surplus property division. They would allow you to go through their process if you want to use them to dispose of the property. They're probably going to charge you, though, so I don't know how viable of an option that would be. In addition to dealing with surplus property, Senate Bill 167 clarifies the law related to the creation of wards, and I know you all do not. Every city council member here is elected at large. But this bill, if you decided you wanted to create the ward system, it would allow you to create a hybrid type system where you all have 12 members of council. Is that right? 8, 12? So you could say 8 of them are in 8 different wards divided by equal population, but 4 of them are at large. So you could create at-large positions in addition to the ward system. Again, it's an option for cities that want to do that. There are only about 4 or 5 cities in Kentucky that have wards or districts, but you know, the whole mantra of the league is more options for local officials, the better. You all decide what works for you all. It removes the requirement for police officer oaths to be taken before the mayor. So that kind of got changed in the classification law. We found out a lot of cities weren't having the mayor administer the oath. They were just taking the oath by themselves. And so we had some city attorneys, Frank, that asked us to remove that out of the statute. Permits a city to enact an ordinance. I don't know whether Erlanger has one. A lot of cities have war memorial commissions that are responsible for the maintenance, upkeep, construction of war memorials within the city limits. Well, the statute required that you have 15 members on a war memorial commission. It was impossible to find 15 citizens to serve on the War Memorial Commission. And so we had some of the cities that had it ask us to reduce that. Rather than changing the number in the statute, we changed it to say a city could enact an ordinance setting a number less than 15 as long as it was at least 5 by ordinance. So that way the city could decide how big it wanted its own War Memorial Commission within those limits. This eliminates the bidding requirement if there's a transfer of property between governmental entities. So right now, the surplus property statute says you can transfer with or without compensation property between governmental entities. So if Erlanger and Ellesmere wanted to Erlanger wanted to treat Ellesmere as a charity case and give them a cruiser or whatever else, you could just give it to them. However, if the cruiser was more than $20,000, Ellesmere would have to bid it. So we needed to get the statutes consistent, so we eliminated the bidding requirements. Even though you're authorized to transfer, for transfer between governmental entities, you no longer have to bid it. Senate Bill 167, for the city clerks, there's 2 statutes that deal with publication of due date of taxes, ad valorem taxes. One of them says, your House Bill 44 limitation says you have to publish your ordinance, set the compensating tax rate, publish your rate. in your ordinance. You do that every single year. And then there's another statute that says 7 to 21 days prior to the due date of the taxes, you have to run another advertisement in the newspaper. Most cities weren't doing it. Just quite frankly, we were probably non-compliant, but some of the clerks caught it and said, it doesn't make sense if we publish the due date when we publish the rate of taxation. Why do we need to publish the due date yet again? So this clarifies that if you publish the due date of taxes when you publish your annual ordinance setting the tax rate, that you don't have to again publish the due date of your taxes. So the clerks asked for that clarification. And it also clarifies the ability of cities to require owners or those having interest in private cemeteries or public cemeteries to properly care for them. In other words, you can apply your nuisance ordinance, high grass ordinance, things like that for the upkeep of even private cemeteries within your city limits. I think that already existed, but there were 2 contradictory statutes, and we just got that clarified. So all that in Senate Bill 16, I guess that's 6 or 7 we went from surplus property to cemeteries to publication of delinquent taxes. That did make the job, you all may call me lazy, that did make the job a little bit easier. Rather than running 6 little bills on those topics, we got creative and did it that way. House Bill 309, public-private partnerships. You heard a lot of press on the P3. Mainly it was related to tolls and all of that issues up here in northern Kentucky and the Brent Spence Bridge. But actually the P3 argument, this doesn't apply to tolls. Arnold Simpson got his amendment in there, and Senator McDaniel and all the northern Kentucky legislators made sure that this bill did not apply to allow tolling on the Brent Spence Bridge. Every northern Kentucky legislator, I think, pretty much made that clear. This bill had exemptions for that. But what it does do is clarify the ability of city governments to enter into public-private partnership agreements for the provision of services that would otherwise typically be performed by a government. So building a parking garage on behalf of the city, but allowing the private entity to collect the user fees for a certain period of time is an example. Different types of agreements, a way to finance it. So that's going to be a new option. It's not a requirement for cities. If cities decide to use a P3 to finance or a private vendor, it sets out what has to be in the agreements. You have to file with DLG. You have to get certain approval through a board if it's greater than 30% of the revenue in your immediately previous fiscal year. And one thing that you may want to be aware of in this, it does probably open up the environment in Kentucky for private vendors to come and make proposals to you all that, hey, you don't have a lot of money, we could do this, make money, would you enter into a P3 agreement? Those are called unsolicited proposals. Even though you may not be looking for something, you may have a private company waltz in and say, here's a proposal for something, or I know you all have talked about constructing this parking garage, or we know you need to do this improvement. Even though you haven't asked for anybody to do it, a private vendor could come in with a proposal. It may increase that. You all don't have to do anything. You can throw it in the trash. If you decide to act, to say, well, this guy walked in, it was a great proposal, we're going to do something like this. They came up with a great idea. If you do that, you have to follow a process, bid for RFPs, make it public that you're going to do it. But if you throw it in the trash, you don't have to do anything at all besides put it in the trash. House Bill 303, that was the budget bill, and House Bill 52, it deals with coal severance funds. You all don't care about that. You all don't have any coal severance or mineral severance here. Okay, good. So, yes. Oh, yeah. Yeah. But what I think is probably going to occur more likely is vendors say, okay, Kentucky's open for business now on P3s, so we have these ideas. We're going to give you a proposal even though you didn't ask for it. I wanted you all to be able to deal with those and realized you didn't have to publish anything or do anything if you wanted to throw it away. But absolutely, you all can go out and say, look, we want to do a P3 agreement. You can do the RFP. You can set that out however you all want to. Now you have positive statutory authority to do it. Senate Bill 122, surprisingly, there wasn't, after foreclosure sales, master commissioner sales, there was not a requirement for those to be filed with the county clerk in any period of time, and we were finding that in some cases, they weren't being filed with the county clerk after the master commissioner sales, and it requires filings of those master commissioner's deeds to be filed with the county clerk within 5 days of the actual sale. Senate Bill 43 deals with the situation where we had an EMT killed in the line of duty in central Kentucky down in Jessamine County. And so it makes survivors of paid or volunteer EMT providers, public EMT providers who are killed in the line of duty, it makes their family eligible for the state lump sum death benefits. Doesn't apply to private providers. It's retroactive to death occurring on or before November 1st, on or after November 1st, 2015. It was called the John Mackey Act because of the guy that was killed. So this does no cost to the city for your EMTs. This is a state lump sum death benefit. Does not apply, would not cost the cities. Senate Bill 195, a lot of people get nervous about this bill because it was called a cancer presumption bill, but we were actually able to work with the firefighters on the legislation related to cancer presumption. You know, the past couple of sessions, they said they wanted cancer presumption to apply to your workers' compensation benefits, to presume that any firefighter who got cancer, it was occupationally related, which meant they would be entitled to workers' comp benefits. This does not. So anybody who tells you Senate Bill 195 is going to result in an increase of your workers' compensation rates is wrong. This, too, deals only with state lump sum in the line of duty death benefits paid by the state. So this will make eligible under certain circumstances and certain types of cancer, excludes tobacco use, families of firefighters who die of cancer within 5 years or during or within 5 years of the completion of their service as a firefighter would be eligible for the state line of duty death benefits. It would be presumed that cancer was in the line of duty as a result of being in the line of duty. And just to be sure, so I did write one provision of this bill, and it's the last bullet point. We very clearly say this shall not be interpreted or construed to apply to any workers' compensation benefits. So they couldn't take the presumption that applied for in the line of duty death benefits and take it over to a workers' comp judge and say, yeah, we should be presumed over here. So we worked with the firefighters on that. As a result, our board supported it. We helped the firefighters get that bill through. Senate Bill 63, you'll notice there's no position on this. The board didn't take any position on this. And that's probably, Chief, because of the Police Chiefs Association, who pretty much said, let's lay low on this. Typically, probably KLC would have opposed it because it has some mandates in there. But when the police chief says, no, we're okay with it, it's going to be okay, which was a better position for us to be in on this bill. You probably read the former auditor found that we had over 3,000 untested rape kits in Kentucky, where victims of sexual assault had no idea who their assailant was. There wasn't any processing at the forensic laboratory, the state police forensic lab in Frankfurt, and they were just collecting dust. There wasn't any effort to find out who their assailant was. So this deals with that. The only way to call it's kind of a travesty. It existed in Kentucky before, and it uses CLEP funds one time to clear the backlog. One thing Governor Bevin's been clear about on CLEP and firefighter incentive pay is that he's not going to allow this continued sweeping of those funds to pay for general fund obligations. As a result, they're probably going to be looking for things that are law enforcement related, or fire-related to spend those funds on, because they're probably not going to increase the incentive pay to $8,000 a year or anything like that. So they used $4.5 million of it to clear the backlog of untested rape kits. Very good thing. Probably going to result in quite a few prosecutions here down the road. But going forward, there were provisions in the bill that ensured that cities, counties, state law enforcement didn't generate this backlog again that we had before. And as a result, it requires law enforcement agencies, so this will be on you, Chief, to adopt policies and procedures manual that's related to sexual assault examinations and the handling of evidence. Now, the Department of Justice is going to give you a sample policy in order to do that. So you all have to implement those and put those into practice in your department. It also requires the Department of Criminal Justice Training to have a minimum of 8 hours of training on sexual assault in basic training. Already there. They already do that. You all know that. Minimum of 8 hours on sexual assault. And it requires the Law Enforcement Council to establish a very specific a sexual assault investigation course that has to be completed by one officer if you have less than 5, 2 officers and more than 5, 4 officers if it's more than 30. So you have particularly trained, more intensively trained officers. This would be 4 for you all. I learned you all have 42. So 4 officers to go through that course that's going to be developed by the Law Enforcement Council, just to be really intense on dealing with sexual assault examinations and handling of the evidence related to it.
On the untested rape kits, is that going to be mandated that all the untested rape kits that are in the evidence room be sent down to be tested, or are there going to have to be certain criteria to be met, such as unqualified victims, witnesses, unmet suspects, dangerous?
You know, I don't know. Particularly, it seems like there was criteria, and I can't remember specifically, Chief, but the Department of Justice is supposed to communicate about what each local law enforcement agency is supposed to forward in terms of clearing the backlog. So I would expect when this goes into effect that you all will get a communication from the Department. I can't remember specifically whether it excluded some or you had to forward them all. I don't think it did. I think there was criteria, and the department was responsible for communicating what to send. Senate Bill 84, this is a crazy bill. Believe it or not, it's illegal for your garbage truck to stop in the street to collect garbage. So, we had to clarify the law that waste haulers could stop in the street to collect the garbage. Now, that seems silly, but let me just tell you from a lawyer's perspective what was happening. So this is more about the law than it is giving your friendly garbage truck drivers the ability to stop in the road. Because the statute made it a violation to stop in the road if you weren't a law enforcement agency or a school bus or something with the stop sign, there's only very limited authorization to stop on a public way. We had 2 or 3 cases where garbage truck stopped, some dumb driver wasn't looking, rear-ended the garbage truck, but guess who paid? The city. The city paid because the garbage truck was violating state statute, which established a per se standard of conduct, which was per se negligence. They stopped in the street in violation of the statute. So we needed to clarify the statute that garbage trucks can do that, so enterprising plaintiffs' attorneys couldn't continue to claim that garbage trucks violated the statute, and we were allowing, even though it was clearly the fault of other drivers that had these mishaps with garbage trucks, the negligence standard came back on the city. So that's really what this clarification was all about. And the plaintiff's attorneys didn't oppose it. I don't think they realized what it was about. House Bill 473. I loved passing this bill. Chief, I'm sorry. If you all do not know what happened with the Department of Criminal Justice Training, they decided they were going to take your police officer's basic training course from 18 weeks to 22 weeks. And that was January 1, 2015. Then the commissioner decided that 22 weeks wasn't enough, that needed to do 23. Did not go through any formal regulation process, did not go through a statute, and pretty much looked at us and said, it's going to be what I say it's going to be. So that kind of ticked me off. And it ticked off the elected officials and some of the police chiefs who were having to pay for the additional cost of the training and the time and the staffing situations. This really isn't an issue about not wanting to have officers safer or not wanting to have officers well-trained and well-equipped. Heck, the league as an insurance company likes to see well-trained officers and be better protected. It's about any state bureaucracy or an individual that holds a state office being able to wave a magic wand or have a stroke of a pen and impact your local budgets without going through any kind of formal process. So it doesn't matter whether it's the Department of Criminal Justice Training, the Department of Energy, the state, the Division of Water, whoever it is. We don't want a secretary or a commissioner or anybody to say, we're just going to do this and we're going to impact your local budget with impunity. So, House Bill 473. House Bill 473 puts in statute, the horse was out of the barn on the 928 hours, so the board agreed, look, they've set up, they've already got there for 23 weeks training course, we put it in statute, but we prohibit the Department for Criminal Justice Training and Law Enforcement Council from changing the number of hours without going through a regulatory process. They have to set the number of hours out in regulation. What does that do? Rather than a bureaucrat just sitting back in their chair saying it's going to be what they say it's going to be, they have to go through a process of public notice, comment, approval by a legislative body administrative regs review subcommittee in order for it to be approved. Both the legislative and the regulatory process are designed to look at what the local mandate is, what the local impact is, whether it has a fiscal impact, whether it has a staffing impact. All of that can be debated and that impact can be, and that's all we're asking for, is for you all to have an opportunity to have input when you make these changes, and they shouldn't be made in isolation. What also scared us at the Department of Criminal Justice Training, the former commissioner down there was saying that we also need to look at the 40 hours incumbent training. And so they were making noise about increasing the in-service training, your 40 hours a year for your current police officers. And that really scared us, that they were just going to up and make it 80 or whatever else. And imagine dealing with that from a staffing perspective. And so we really wanted to tie their hands on that. And we said, if you want to do that, you're going to have to go through the legislature and actually pass a law. Now, go back to the first slide. How many bills passed that we opposed? 0. So they wouldn't just be able to do that. They would have to work together rather than just announce a rule. So in addition to dealing with police officers, we thought it would be wise to also deal with dispatcher training. Changes in dispatcher training, basic training has to be changed by regulation, changes in 8 hours in service. Mark has to go through legislative process in order to do that. So the department's going to have to work with us rather than tell us what they're going to do. And what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Firefighters, the Fire Commission is prohibited from changing their basic training course or their annual in-service courses without legislation unless they're going to decrease it, and if they're going to decrease it, they can do it by administrative regulation. So the Fire Commission actually supported us on the bill, thought it was a good clarification. The Department of Criminal Justice Training tries to cause problems, but we still passed it anyway. I think all of this, honestly, is probably subject to greater collaboration and discussion, whether 23 weeks is necessary, whether you need to come down to my hometown of Richmond for 40 hours for your in-service training, or whether other types of training courses, whether you actually take the time to get legal updates or diminishable skills training. We have a new commissioner of the Department of Criminal Justice Training, and happens to be a good friend, Mark Filburn, who was their law enforcement specialist at Kentucky League of Cities. Just got named on Friday, the new commissioner of the Department of Criminal Justice Training, who is a fine, fine human being, one, but two, also knows a lot, had a distinguished law enforcement career, and is very open in terms of having a collaborative process. He won't be a pushover by any means, but he will be open to looking at different ways of doing things rather than the revenue. So hopefully this helps you all from getting sabotaged from a budgetary or staffing perspective going forward. Senate Bill 206, we had a lot of law enforcement stuff this session. And I thought we would fight with the police chiefs because we started off the session because the Northern Kentucky chiefs in particular wrote a letter that said, oh, you all shouldn't be, you're all an insurance company, you have no need weighing in on the training hours and all that stuff.
I've got a comment on that.
You do?
I have to, because that was written by two individuals that included a lot of names that weren't privy to the communication prior to it being sent. Me being one of those, my name was on the letterhead, and it was sent without my knowledge, and we only found out when we received communication
When you received a copy of it?
from you.
Oh, wow.
From you or your office.
Wow.
A lot of the chief's names on that letterhead.
No clue it was coming.
They said they were not drafting the letter. And then it came out, and then I got the letter from your office, and I was like, oh.
Yeah.
So a lot of chiefs that,
So we're not putting your chief in the category. But I thought, I thought it was going to be particularly tense with the chiefs, that the chiefs were not going to stand up for themselves to say, look, we ought to weigh in on this. The law enforcement council, the commissioner shouldn't do it. We ended up coming to a consensus, even with Chief Turner, who wrote the letter, who ended up coming to Frankfort almost every time we called on him, and developed a much better relationship on this legislation. He went and testified with us. He actually sat at the table with us on 473 on the training bill. So the chiefs got much more active, and we've developed a pretty close, which we need from a city perspective. You all elected officials, with all due respect, you're just not experts in law enforcement. Neither am I. And so we need that relationship and the expertise with the chiefs. So we wound up having a really good session, even though I thought it was going to be disastrous because of that letter. But we got it all clarified, and everybody's good. And I'm glad you weren't. I'm glad you weren't on it. And Chief Turner has since apologized, saying, I guess I should have just called you before I sent a letter. I said, yeah, that's pretty easy. Senate Bill 206 is going to save cities a whole lot of money. And it's a good bill. Sheriff's departments, Senator Carroll from Paducah, he was the assistant chief of police in Paducah and was actually eligible to be chief, but the former mayor didn't make him police chief, so he decided to become a state senator. And thank goodness he's in the state senate now. And because he's really helpful on these law enforcement issues, you'll see he's also helped us on our 911 bill. But Senate Bill 206 passed. It permits cities to do like sheriff's departments do. They can rehire retired peace officers for one-year terms. That's retired from cities, retired from county sheriff's departments, retired from county police departments. I know you have one of those up here. Or the state police for one-year terms without making employer contributions to the retirement system or without reimbursing or paying for health insurance. So it would allow them to keep getting their state health insurance. No, and I think you all estimated maybe $70,000 for the retirees here in Erlanger by itself. Really important for small police departments, especially with that 23-week training course now, to be able to do that. In order to be eligible, the rehired retiree has to have 20 years of service. They have to have the time of separation, the 30 days going from hazardous to hazardous, have no pending administrative charges, so they didn't leave under circumstances where they were subject to disciplinary procedure. or no, and you can't have a pre-existing agreement. From the time, and that let me just be specific on defining that pre-existing agreement from the time you're an active employee before you retire until you take that first position of employment. They're hired on one-year terms, which may be renewed annually, so it's a one-year term. Now, this provision is actually wrong. It says they're not subject, that are rehired. This says they're not subject to Bill of Rights or all the other statutes. They actually are during the time that they're employed, subject to all merit system, or if that applies, they're subject to the Bill of Rights, any other 95-450 during the time that they're employed. However, the renewal of the one-year term, anytime you look to renew the one-year term, it is not subject to any of these things. So your choice not to renew the one-year term would not apply the Bill of Rights or any of those provisions. Cities are limited in the number they can hire based on the size of the department. Small departments, we wanted to give a little preferential treatment to say, look, you can have all 5 or under, all 5 of them can be rehired retirees. Cities with 5 to 100, they are either limited to 5 or 25% of the number of officers employed during calendar year 2015, whichever is greater. So that's, for one that had 100, it would be 25 positions could be hired as rehired retirees. House Bill 189 actually was prompted by law enforcement as well. We actually drafted a bill. They've created a heroin task force down in central Kentucky. You see all the central Kentucky sheriffs and police departments, about 40 entities, including the UK Police Department. They call it backups, have authorized the exercise of peace officer powers in all their jurisdiction. Now, state police got nervous thinking we were creating a secret state police force. That's not the case. All this does, even though it helps that situation there, this amends the interlocal agreement process generally. And it just says, look, if you're adding or subtracting parties to an interlocal agreement, you don't have to go back through the full review process of the Department for Local Government or the full review process for the Attorney General if they have jurisdiction. You just need to submit the names of the additional governmental entities that become party to the agreement and submit those forms to the county clerk and submit those forms of those additional parties to the DLG or Kentucky Office of Attorney General, whichever one has jurisdiction. Generally, that's going to be DLG. Sometimes the Kentucky Office of Attorney General does if it involves a state agency that's party to the interlocal agreement. So no more waiting 3 or 4 months. If you're just adding or subtracting parties, real simple, just file that form. House Bill 124, body-worn camera grants. So now, in addition to body armor and tasers, the grants, the funds generated from the auction of confiscated firearms can now be used in a grant application to purchase body-worn cameras. So you'll see me and Representative Dennis Keene from Campbell County here testifying on the bill. We opposed the bill to start with because Keene had written the bill to say that you had to have a policy on body-worn cameras that was approved by the Kentucky Law Enforcement Council. Now, one thing we've learned after all this training thing is that the Law Enforcement Council is responsible for training content, not approval of local government law enforcement policies. So we opposed it until that was changed. So we did agree that in order to be eligible for the grant, you ought to have some policy in place on body-worn cameras. So what we do is allow the proceeds. First, body armor is funded, then tasers and body-worn cameras are on the same level for second priority funding in order to get that. In order to be eligible for those funds, you have to submit your policy to the Office of Homeland Security, whatever the policy is. It doesn't say what it has to be. It doesn't have to be approved by anybody. Your policy has to be submitted with a grant application if you want to use those funds to purchase body-worn cameras. So that was a good compromise, I thought. Prove you got a policy, and instead of having the state mandate what it would be. House Bill 422. Frank, whoever your code enforcement officer is, this is going to require a little bit of work by January 1. Every city is going to pretty much have to amend its ordinance related to code enforcement. This bill was actually produced as a result of city attorneys kept telling us, Frank, we need everything in one statute, everything in one statutory scheme. As you well know, I kept resisting that, saying, well, it's great. We've got 82 over here. We've got 65 over here. The banks don't know whether we're coming and going. We can do what we want to do. Well, it finally caught up with us. The banks were prepared to file a lawsuit to challenge